Tensions are deepening between Russia and the West over Ukraine, with Moscow planning to appeal against the United States and the European Union to the World Trade Organization. The economy minister, Alexei Ulyukayev, says the latest round of Western sanctions have forced Moscow to make such a decision. Meanwhile, the foreign ministry has, in a statement, lashed out at Washington over its policies, saying the U.S. has adopted a confrontational course towards Russia. According to the ministry, the U.S. has adopted another hostile measure by imposing new sanctions against Russia. The ministry says the imposition of counter-sanctions against the U.S. and the EU will not take long. Well, to discuss that further, I joined Marcus Papadopoulos, who is a publisher and editor of Politics First, and he's joining us live now via Skype from London. Sir, thanks very much for joining us here on Press TV. What kind of a case do you think Russia has when it takes this these sanctions case to the WTO?
Well, Russia has a very legitimate case. Russia played a very important role in bringing peace to eastern Ukraine. It brought the Ukrainian government and it brought the resistance movement in eastern Ukraine to the negotiating table. But for the West, it doesn't matter that Russia played a very important role in bringing peace to eastern Ukraine, because Russia is a resurgent country in 2014. And that is what the problem is for the West. For the West, principally the Americans, it's the fact that Russia is not weak today. Russia is not dependent on the Americans and the Europeans for loans and loans from the IMF. So whatever Russia does internationally, the Americans will always seek to try and isolate Russia internationally. And the sanctions are an integral part of that. Sanctions are one of the most formidable weapons in the West's arsenal. They've used them against Cuba, they've used them against Iran, and they're using them against Russia now. And the sanctions are all about bullying a country and a government which doesn't follow the line of the United States foreign policy into submission. And of course, Russia will not tolerate being bullied by the Americans, because Russia is an independent sovereign country which has every right to be pursuing its foreign policy objectives on the international arena.
Indeed, and I wanted to speak about that, the fact that Russia is not a pushover country, so to speak, in the world. What kind of countermeasures can Russia take, and how much of an effect do you think realistically that will have on the Western world?
Well, the sanctions the West, the Americans and the Europeans, are placing on the Russian economy, they are going to harm the Russian economy. There's no question about that. But in turn, the Russians will also place sanctions, or it looks very much like the Russians will place sanctions on the American economy and the European economy. And that could have a very, very adverse effect on those economies. For example, Russia could look to limiting gas supplies to Europe, oil supplies to Europe, and that would put the European economies in a very, very dangerous situation, because of course Europe is starting to come out of the recession. Germany, for example, is dependent on 1/3 of its gas from Russia. So the Russian sanctions will harm the Europeans in particular, but also the Americans, just as much as the sanctions that the West is placing on Russia will harm the Russian economy.
We just have under a minute left. How do you think this will then affect what many people are calling the split between the EU and the US over the policies towards Russia? Because obviously the EU will be much more adversely affected by any Russian countermeasures.
Well, Europe is, in my opinion, reluctantly going along with these sanctions. They're being pushed into these sanctions by the Americans. But the brutal reality is that Europe is a strategic ally of the Americans. And when push comes to shove, strategic allies, they do stick together. So publicly, of course, the Europeans will say that we want to place these sanctions on Russia. But privately, there will be a lot of concern. But there's not going to be any change, because as I just said, when push comes to shove, allies will always stick together. And the Americans do have a very strong political and economic and military hold over Europe.
Okay, we'll leave it there on that note. But of course, we do appreciate you speaking to us. That was Mr. Marcus Papadopoulos speaking to us live from London.